A deer walked into camp this morning, not running, not startled, not cornered by anything. Just walked in at a measured pace, with the specific quality of deliberateness that separates intentional approach from accidental proximity. She moved past the fire pit, past two people who stopped what they were doing to watch with the specific stillness you learn when something unusual requires observation rather than reaction, and stopped near the edge of the shelter area. And then she lay down a fawn. Set it down is probably more accurate. Lowered it gently from where she had been carrying it, nudging it into a patch of dry grass with her nose, checking it over briefly. The fawn was small. Too small. Something had happened to it. A leg, maybe, or simply the kind of fragile borderline viability that very new, very young animals sometimes arrive in the world with. Whatever it was, the mother had assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion. She stayed for a moment, made a sound. Not alarm, not distress. Something quieter. And then she left. Back out of camp the same way she had come, with the same measured deliberateness. And did not immediately return. The people in the camp looked at each other, then looked at the fawn, then looked at each other again, and someone walked over and picked it up. This is not a fairy tale. This is a category of event documented in traditional communities across the world, across many different species, across thousands of years of human-animal coexistence. And the question it raises, why would a wild animal trust humans with something as fundamentally precious as its own offspring, is one of the most revealing questions you can ask about the ancient relationship between humans and the wild world. The answer goes much deeper than kindness. It goes to the heart of what ancient humans were, how animals perceived them, and the specific kind of interspecies understanding that developed across hundreds of thousands of years of shared ecological community. Let's start by establishing that this kind of behavior, wild animals leaving offspring in human proximity, is not as anomalous as it appears. Across the ethnographic literature of traditional hunter-gatherer communities, accounts of wild animals leaving injured or vulnerable offspring near human camps appear with enough consistency to constitute a pattern rather than a series of isolated incidents. In traditional communities in various parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, researchers have documented occasions on which wild animals, deer, various bovids, wild boar, even some primate species, placed injured or very young offspring near human habitation sites in apparent preference to other available locations. The modern wildlife rehabilitation context is where this behavior is most systematically documented. Wildlife rehabilitators who work in areas adjacent to traditional communities report that wild animals in those areas show measurably reduced wariness of human proximity when the animals are in crisis compared to the same species in areas without long human habitation history. The assessment that appears to be happening, and this is interpretation, not certainty, is something like proximity to these specific humans is safer for this vulnerable offspring than any available alternative. This is not random behavior. Animals that place vulnerable offspring near humans are making a risk calculation. They are assessing the threat level of a specific human presence and comparing it against the alternative risks. Predator access in the open, exposure, inability of the injured animal to survive, independent of care. For that calculation to produce a choice in favor of human proximity, the animal must have accumulated experience indicating that human proximity is genuinely less threatening than the alternatives. The behavior is evidence of a specific and positive learned relationship. Let's talk about how that learned relationship develops, because the fawn in the camp did not arrive there by accident. It arrived there because of a history. The mother had almost certainly been in proximity to this specific group of humans before. Not as prey, she was obviously not prey in this encounter, as a known presence in a shared landscape. In small group ancient communities that maintained consistent territories over generations, the individual animals of those territories were known to the humans, and the humans were known to the animals in ways that the modern urban human's relationship to wildlife never achieves. Traditional hunter-gatherer communities that have been studied in depth by anthropologists report a level of individual animal recognition. The ability to identify specific individual animals by appearance, behavior, territory, and history that modern wildlife biologists achieve only through years of systematic study with marking technology. Ancient hunters knew the specific individual deer in their territory. They knew which individuals were more skittish and which were less so, which had associated with human presence before and which had not, which were the mothers of specific offspring in previous seasons. And the individual animals of those territories knew the humans. Not as an undifferentiated category of threat, but as specific individuals with known behavioral histories. The deer that walked into camp had a cognitive model of the specific humans in that camp, built from seasons of observation at close range, from the specific behavioral signals those humans had produced in her presence across multiple encounters, from the accumulated evidence of whether those humans had treated her as prey or as a non-threatening cohabitant of a shared landscape. That cognitive model, built across years of specific encounters, is what made her approach possible. She was not trusting humans in the abstract. She was trusting these specific people in this specific camp based on accumulated specific evidence. Let's talk about what ancient humans were doing to build that trust, because the deer's assessment of human non-threat did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from specific human behaviors that communicated non-threat over extended periods of time. The management of behavior around wild animals whose trust was developing was almost certainly part of the practical behavioral repertoire of ancient communities in stable territories. Not as a formal practice with explicit rules, ancient behavioral knowledge was rarely formal in that sense, but as accumulated, transmitted understanding of how to behave around specific species in specific contexts to produce specific outcomes. Moving slowly, avoiding direct eye contact, which many species read as predatory targeting. Producing low, non-alarming sounds rather than silence or sudden noise. Positioning the body in non-predatory orientations, not the crouched, focused, aligned with prey posture of hunting approach, but the upright, lateral, dispersed attention of non-hunting movement through space. These are specific behavioral signals that communicate non-threat to prey species, and they are documented in the behavioral repertoires of traditional hunters who understand that the ability to move through the landscape without alarming prey is a form of ecological knowledge as important as any other. Ancient communities that maintained stable territories over generations were continuously practicing this behavioral management in the normal course of moving through their landscape. The deer learned to read their specific behavioral signals because those signals were consistent, predictable, and repeatedly associated with non-harmful outcomes. The trust built through exactly this kind of consistent, repeated, non-harmful encounter? Not through any specific intention to build trust, but through the consistent character of human behavior in a specific landscape across a specific extended period. Now, let's talk about what happened to the fawn, because this is where the story of wild animal trust connects directly to the practices that eventually produced domestication. The ancient humans who encountered the fawn in camp almost certainly had some understanding of what they were dealing with. Not as a philosophical question about interspecies trust, but as a practical situation with specific immediate requirements. They had seen young animals before. They had seen animals that were injured or vulnerable before. The community's accumulated knowledge of animal behavior, physiology, and care included knowledge relevant to this specific situation. Feeding a young ungulate, what to feed it, how to feed it, at what intervals, is knowledge that traditional communities in landscapes with deer and similar animals accumulated through exactly these kinds of encounters across generations. The specific plant milks the animal milks from other species. The specific techniques for encouraging a young animal to nurse from a human caregiver rather than its mother. This knowledge exists in traditional communities, and was almost certainly present in ancient communities that regularly encountered these situations. The fawn that was cared for in the human camp was not a pet in the modern sense. It was a member of the ecological community being tended by another member of the ecological community in a moment of need. The same kind of tending that we have documented ancient communities providing to disabled human community members, to injured adults, to vulnerable individuals of their own species. The extension of that care capacity to a vulnerable member of another species was not a dramatic conceptual leap for communities whose ecological worldview understood the human community as embedded within rather than separate from the broader community of living things. And the outcomes of these encounters The young animals that survived because of human care, that were raised in proximity to the human camp, that developed as a consequence the specific behavioral imprinting on humans that made them genuinely tame, were the specific foundation events of domestication. Domestication did not begin in ancient breeding programs. It began in moments exactly like this one. A vulnerable animal, a human community with the knowledge and the inclination to provide care, and the specific interspecies relationship that developed from that provision of care. Let's talk about the neurological mechanism that makes wild animals capable of the kind of trust we are describing, because the biology here is genuinely interesting. The stress response system in mammals, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs the fight or flight response, is modulated by early developmental experience in ways that have profound lifelong consequences. Young animals that develop in the presence of non-threatening stimuli, including non-threatening human presence, show fundamentally different stress response profiles as adults than animals raised without that early exposure. They have lower baseline cortisol levels, lower reactivity to novel stimuli, and specifically reduced threat responses to human-associated stimuli. This is the neurological basis of imprinting and early socialization effects in animal behavior. The well-documented phenomenon in which specific types of early experience produce specific and often permanent modifications in adult behavioral dispositions. A young deer raised in human proximity does not simply learn that humans are non-threatening in the way that adult learning works. It develops a nervous system that is constitutively less reactive to human presence. A nervous system that is literally wired differently because of early developmental experience. The fawn in the camp, if it survived and was raised in human proximity through its early development, would have become an animal with permanently reduced human wariness. Not because it was trained, not because it was conditioned through reward and punishment, but because its developing nervous system incorporated human presence as a baseline feature of its safe environment. It would approach humans readily as an adult. It would show lower flight distances. It would tolerate human touch with equanimity that unhabituated deer do not show. And crucially, it would be more likely to behave toward humans the way its mother had behaved, with specific tolerance, even in vulnerable moments. The behavior we started with, the mother leaving her offspring in human proximity, becomes more comprehensible when you consider that the mother herself may have had early developmental experience that reduced her human wariness. Her trust was not just learned in adult life. It may have been neurologically established in early development by proximity to humans in exactly the kind of camp that her offspring now found itself in. Let's talk about what other species showed evidence of trust-based relationships with ancient humans, because deer and wolves are the most documented, but not the only cases. Wild boar and ancient humans had a complex relationship that included significant components of mutual tolerance and, in some cases, active cooperation. Boar are intelligent, social, and, in stable territories with consistent human presence, capable of the same kind of graduated habituation and trust development that deer demonstrate. The eventual domestication of pigs from wild boar represents one of the most successful domestication events in human history, and the trajectory from wild boar tolerated near human camps to domestic pig is a version of the same story as the wolf-to-dog trajectory. Raptors and corvids, birds that ancient humans regularly interacted with in the context of hunting, showed specific forms of trust in their relationships with human hunters. Ravens that followed hunting parties and participated in the spoils of kills were demonstrating a specific form of trust-based cooperation. They would not have continued following hunters who presented threat rather than opportunity. The specific corvid behavior of following hunter-gatherer groups, alerting them to game, and sharing in kills represents a long-developed interspecies partnership that required sustained mutual non-aggression to develop and maintain. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, were large, dangerous animals in their undomesticated form, capable of killing adult humans in conflict. And yet the domestication trajectory from aurochs to domestic cattle required a beginning point of reduced wariness, of individuals within aurochs populations that showed less reactive responses to human proximity, that could be approached and eventually managed without the full threat response that their natural behavioral repertoire included. The ancient humans who began that trajectory had to have been working with individual aurochs that had already developed some degree of reduced wariness, exactly the kind of individual variation in threat reactivity that population-level experience with non-threatening humans produces. Let's talk about the specific ancient camp context that made these relationships possible, because the specific social environment of the ancient human camp was a unique ecological feature that no other species in the landscape was providing. The ancient human camp was, from the perspective of the animals of the surrounding landscape, an extraordinary ecological anomaly. A location that was simultaneously warm, fire, consistently occupied, social group, rich in food scraps and organic resources, camp detritus, and, crucially for the trust question, a location from which organized predation rarely if ever originated in the immediate vicinity. Ancient hunters did not typically hunt in the immediate vicinity of their camps. The camp was a social and domestic space, not a hunting space. Animals that learned to distinguish camp proximity from hunter in landscape learned that camp proximity was specifically safe from the most immediate human threat, organized predation. The camp was a refuge from hunting, not a hunting ground. This spatial differentiation of human activity, domestic non-threatening camp versus active hunting landscape, is the specific ecological feature that allowed wild animals to develop trust relationships with human camps while maintaining wariness of human hunters in the landscape. The animal that approached the camp was not making a mistake about human dangerousness. It was making an accurate assessment of the specific human activity pattern, knowing that the camp was a specific context in which humans were not hunting. The sophistication of that distinction requires significant cognitive capability. It requires the ability to assess context. Where are we? What specific human behaviors are present? What has been the history of this specific location with these specific humans? Rather than simply responding to human present as a uniform threat stimulus. The animals that made this distinction accurately were the animals that survived and reproduced in human-occupied territories, because inaccurate assessments in either direction were costly. The cognitive capability to make the distinction was selectively maintained in the animal populations of long human-occupied territories. Here is the dimension of this story that I think matters most, and that most discussions of human-animal trust completely miss. The relationship was not unidirectional. It was not humans being generous to animals who were receiving that generosity. It was a genuine interspecies relationship in which both parties were active participants, both were making assessments, both were contributing to the relationship's development, and both were receiving benefits. The ancient human community that received the fawn gained something real, something beyond the immediate satisfaction of caring for a vulnerable creature. They gained a relationship with the specific animal, yes, but more broadly, they gained and maintained a place within the ecological community of their landscape that was distinct from simple predator-prey positioning. They were part of something larger, a community of living things that recognized each other in their specific characters and that organized their interactions accordingly. The deer that left her fawn gained the specific benefit we have described: care for a vulnerable offspring in a moment of need. But she also, in that act, expressed something about the relationship that her community had developed with the human community, the specific trust that made leaving something precious with another species not an act of desperation, but an act of assessment. The assessment that these humans were, in the relevant moment, the best option, and that assessment was correct. The community cared for the fawn. Not because of any formal obligation, not because of a calculated benefit, but because they were the kind of community that cared for vulnerable things, because that is what the evidence, across the full scope of ancient human behavior, consistently shows ancient communities were. The fawn survived, the mother returned. Not immediately, these things do not work on human social timescales. But she returned, came back to the edge of camp, checked on her offspring, made the specific sounds of recognition and reconnection, and stayed, for a while, in proximity to the humans who had held her most vulnerable thing while she was gone. That is trust, not trust in the abstract, not trust as a philosophical concept, but trust as a specific, earned, functionally demonstrated feature of a specific interspecies relationship between specific animals and specific humans in a specific landscape over a specific history of shared experience. It is one of the most extraordinary things that has ever existed between our species and another. It is ancient. It is documented. It is the foundation of every domestication, every wildlife relationship, every moment in which a human and a wild animal have encountered each other without the transaction of predator and prey. It happened. It was real. And it tells us something about ancient humans that no tool find or cave painting can quite capture on its own. That they were the kind of creatures that the wildest things in their world sometimes chose to trust.